Hello everyone. So I'm Vijay Sivaraman, CEO and co-founder of Canopus Networks and also a professor at UNSW. It's a real pleasure for me to invite Kurt Rodgers for a conversation. Kurt is the network strategy manager at Chorus. And we're going to be talking about the role of fiber in broadband and how it compares against FWA and other technologies. So welcome, Kurt, to the show. And if you could just briefly tell us a bit about Chorus and your role there.
Great. Well, thanks, Vijay. Thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So Chorus New Zealand are one of New Zealand's largest digital infrastructure providers. We've got a nationwide fibre network that connects the majority of New Zealand homes, businesses, data centres, and what we call smart locations, things like our bus stops and traffic lights. We've also got a LoRaWAN IoT network, and we also offer data centre hosting and connectivity related things. So that's our role. Now we are wholesale, so we really do provide the bulk of New Zealand's digital infrastructure through a whole range of channel partners for much of New Zealand. Wonderful.
So Kurt, what prompted this conversation is actually an article that appeared on the 3rd of December in Comms Day from Analysis Maison, which talked about how FW could really be a transitionary measure, and fiber is really the real thing when it comes to broadband. And I picked up on some of the statements and quotes you had made in that article. So let's talk a bit about growth, the demand for data, and that's one of the big drivers, to why fiber could be really the best option for broadband. So tell us a little bit about growth.
Sure. So actually, last decade, everyone was experiencing really crazy growth rates of about 50% per annum. Which is just crazy. And like that has softened down this decade, but we're still seeing really, really solid growth. I mean, we've just done our numbers for last quarter, finishing in December, and the average monthly data usage on our network was 644 gigabytes a month. And that was 6% up quarter on quarter. So just in one quarter, demand grew by 6%. So and I think many other operators around the world, Analysis Mason do forecasts as well, is growth's around about that 10 to 20% range, and it fluctuates a bit. So that's what we're sort of seeing now. So your other question was what's driving that, and look, there's a whole different range of things, and I think one of the big things that's often missed is the transition from linear TV to broadcasting. And obviously a decade ago, Netflix really started that process. But when you look at the detail, what's really interesting is there's still a lot of the market who don't use streaming TV and still get the majority of their TV content through offline terrestrial or satellite sources. And what we're seeing is possibly an acceleration towards finishing that job, right? So it's not us early adopters where the growth's coming from. It's actually what we would consider to be low data users where the growth's coming from. Perhaps that older age group that are, like watching, the same TV programs that they're used to. Well, they are just at the start of transitioning to online TV, often watching the same things that they were watching. And often it's not through those global players like Netflix, it's through the domestic providers. And in New Zealand, the domestic providers have seen, for example, TVNZ, one of the main domestic TV providers, sees a 25% increase in streaming. And so I think that's one of the things that's just really quite a basic thing is the increasing penetration and increasing use of streaming TV, particularly in what you would traditionally consider to be a late adopter and low data usage audience, right? So that's one big thing. Another thing that happened particularly in the last quarter is we seem to have a lot of live streaming sport events. And this was specific to New Zealand in a way. The cricket team, our cricket team was in India, and so that was streamed. And we did really well. We actually bet India in a series. So it was a historical event. We also had the All Blacks were touring the UK and Europe. And so all of those things were being streamed. And there was just a high number of those streaming events, which were really popular. And of course, more and more people are watching streaming TV. And then, of course, the new thing happened, which was the Netflix live streaming event of the boxing. So that was like something quite new. I think 55 million people worldwide simultaneously streamed that. And look, we heard there were some problems on the Netflix side in streaming it, but we saw a huge surge on our network. So I think, that's all quite new. And I think we're going to see a lot more live sports streaming happening, and with these new players entering the market. And so it's actually just that, pretty much bread and water stuff. TV streaming, live streaming, they are still the main things that are really driving that baseline growth rate.
Absolutely. Look, I think I'm going to pick up on a few points you've made, but maybe not the India-Australia series, given that I support India. But apart from that, live streaming is indeed becoming really big. And I was looking, and I think I did a LinkedIn post just last week on $10 billion was spent in 2024 by the Netflix's, Primes, etc., to buy these streaming rights. And I do believe live streaming is where the next kind of battleground is going to be for these big kind of content providers to start capturing.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I do want to come back to, I think you said that the average usage consumption was about 650 gigabytes, give or take, with 6% quarter-to-quarter growth. I was looking at the numbers from the Internet Activity Report from the ACCC in Australia. The number's not too far off. I think the average, and this is going back to June last year, was about 450 gigabytes. Interestingly, the average on a mobile service was about 11.7 gigabytes.
That's
Even
right.
accounting for the fact that a household has 2.5 people on average, which is what the census statistics tells us, it's still a 15x higher demand for data on a per person basis on a broadband than on a mobile phone, on a mobile service, right? So which I think is so the implication of this seems to be that because the volume is so high, so much higher when you're at home, the cost has to, this has to be borne out in the cost, right?
That's right.
We know that the cost per bit is much lower on fiber than on competing technologies like FWA or satellite for that matter. So the volume itself could really be a strong reason to believe that going forward, fiber is really going to be the most cost effective. Would you say that's the case?
Absolutely. And a lot of it's about the time frame you're looking at it over. Look, fiber does have a high upfront cost from a build perspective, right? We've built a lot of New Zealand's fiber infrastructure, so we know that when you go and build it initially, it does have a high initial cost, right? But if you only focus on the initial cost, you sort of miss the picture, right? And if this is infrastructure investment, you have to look at the 20, 30, 40, 50 year overall total cost of ownership. And without a doubt, fiber has the lowest total cost of ownership over that period of time. And, particularly when you're talking about mobile and moving that is being used for fixed wireless services, that tends to have a very short use life. So it might have a lower cost to build, but you're only going to be able to use that for about 5 years, and then it sort of extinguishes its capacity because of growth issues. So your perspective about what is the most cost effective really comes to the time period that you're going to discount that rate over, right? And so that's really the economic situation. But one of the features of fiber is it does have that incredibly long asset life, and it's not particularly cost sensitive to capacity or demand. So again, most of the cost of fiber is in the initial build. It is actually it's incredibly scalable, and so it's really relatively easy to add lots of capacity to fiber. Whereas in a mobile network for mobility purposes, and the mobile network also using the same share of capacity for fixed wireless, it is actually just a lot more expensive to add to augment capacity on that network. So that is the primary reason why in markets around the world, and particularly in New Zealand, the fixed wireless services targets low data users, right? And so you see this in all the ad campaigns and the uptakes and everything, is mobile operators specifically target the lowest data users because that's where the economics works for them. But the economics don't really work. Now, who knows what that pivot rate is, but the rate that we're seeing growth and the 650 gigabytes we're seeing already, I mean, that suits the economics of fibre.
Makes absolute sense. So look, I think, Kurt, on the cost side and the effectiveness at high volumes, I think the economics definitely plays out in favor of fibre. I also want to touch upon experience. Now, we talked about data volumes, but let's talk a bit about experience, which is often dictated by things like speed. What speed do you get at any instant of time? What are the latencies you're getting? And importantly, what is the stability of a connection if you're, let's say, watching a live sport event or doing a cloud game or something of that nature? So tell us a bit about your views on, in addition to the volumes, how does experience, often indicated by speed, stability, and latency, how they also play out in terms of fiber versus the other technologies?
Yeah, look, and I am an engineer by trade, so I could actually come from a bottom up and describe the physics and technical designs to bring that reason. But actually, I think it's probably better to come from the consumer perspective. And actually, what I'm about to say is basically just repeating what our competition regulator produces. So in New Zealand, the Commerce Commission do a report where they test all the technologies and publish a report. It's called Measuring Broadband New Zealand. And, every single metric they measure, fibre is just so far ahead of wireless. And wireless is actually, you could say almost on a par with copper services like ADSL and VDSL. Some of the metrics, VDSL is better than fibre. That's right. Some of the metrics they do show that VDSL is actually better than fixed wireless, and sometimes it's the other way around. So I think we need to think about fibre's, the gold standard up here. Every metric you can think of, downstream speed, upstream speed, latency, all of that stuff, fibre's way up here. Wireless is sort of competing with sort of enhanced copper services. I think, particularly to your point, it's not just the speed and latency. There's two actually really interesting metrics that report does. One of them is called disconnects. Now, the methodology they use actually just looks to detect micro glitches or micro disconnects, just a few seconds or whatever. Now, if you're streaming Netflix, you won't notice that because of the way that your screen will cache it. But if you're live streaming or we're doing a Zoom call like this, you will notice that little glitch. And what their report shows is that the frequency of glitches, disconnects on fibre is near zero. You have to get right into the decimal places for that. And it's actually much, much, much higher on fixed wireless. And for those who understand how wireless technology works, you'll easily explain this. It's got a really tough job in doing radio resource allocation to multiple people all at the same time. And so sometimes you get these little glitches, which again are fine if you're just doing a bit of streaming or a bit of browsing. But actually, it's not fine when you are doing something a bit more serious. Another one of the metrics, which is really interesting, is they call it latency under load. So we could think about that someone else in your house is doing a file download. Meanwhile, you're on a Zoom call. How does that load affect your experience on that Zoom call? Again, what it shows is there's almost negligible impact on fibre, but basically the latency on fixed wireless just escalates under load, and for like the Zoom call would become unusable. So I think there's some technical sort of facts there that we're not producing that is produced there, which shows that fixed wireless is okay for low data users, and it's okay for sort of best effort things, a bit of streaming, bit of browsing. But actually, if you are in a business meeting on a Zoom call, or you're wanting to watch, New Zealand beat India again in a cricket test match, and you're getting down to that last over, and you don't want to miss it, then actually, fibre performs. It's more reliable. There's a much bigger. It's just much more reliable in delivering that consistent experience that people want.
I'm really glad we could bring out the engineer in you and speak to those metrics. Incidentally, disconnects is something that we have actually worked with another operator and tried to quantify. It is an issue. And the problem with this is it's so intermittent that it's hard to pin down. And for operators, firstly, when users call in and complain about that, it's hard to figure out what exactly happened because it's not very replicable. And operators often struggle with that. And it's also a metric that's not really reported in a lot of the reports. So a lot of reports will capture the basic speed and latency. But as you say, disconnects and latency under load, these are very important from a user experience perspective. That's not always captured. So I'm really, really glad you brought them up. And the fact that fiber has a very distinct advantage, not just in speed, latency, and of course, cost, as we talked about before, but also in these very important metrics that often determine experience. So,
and actually, can I just add one more thing? Because something that we've proven in our lab, so it's not yet something that's done by the Commerce Commission, but actually we've noticed a huge difference in streaming, actually. So, for those out there who do understand that streaming uses what's called adaptive bit rate, right? And when you press play, it takes a while for a streaming video to move up to its full bit rate. And what we see with fibre is you can almost count down. At the 12-second mark, that Netflix 4K streaming service will get to the 4K bit rate. And so I've done plenty of demos in my lab where I actually play the show and I go, on the count of 3, this is going to click through to full 4K bit rate. 3, 2, 1, go. And that's just the consistency. And then you switch that TV over to Starlink or wireless or even copper broadband, and it's random about how long it takes to get to 4K, and often it never ever gets to 4K, and the adaptive bit rate is busy, going up and down and up and down and up and down, which I think goes back to what we're just talking about. It's the latency underload and the disconnect. It's the variability of performance, and you just don't see that if you focus on speed and latency. It's actually the consistency that really makes that difference.
Fantastic. That's absolutely brilliant to hear. Now, you said you've seen this in the lab, and that's kind of going to transition into my next question, which is, if you have the opportunity to do these kind of measurements in the wild at scale, what are some of the measurements of both, usage behaviors? What are the kind of applications? Are people really doing a lot of cloud gaming or Apple Vision Pro headsets or whatever it is? But also being able to understand these minute aspects of experience, like how long before the Netflix stream really ramps up to the full 4K capability, etc. Love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the experience measures you really think, and usage measures that you think you'd love to be able to see at scale from the network. And also, what do you currently have? Where do you think some of the gaps are? And what could some of the benefits of that be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And just to one bit of context is actually with fibre, we actually have enough speed and we have enough low latency. So actually, we need to stop talking about faster speeds and lower latencies. It's already here in New Zealand. We've got 72% uptake of fibre. So and the majority of that's on a 300 megabit plan. I can do a ping here on 1 millisecond from all the Netflix caches in Auckland where I live. So actually speed and latency has been solved, right? Where the issue is exactly what you're talking about, is how does that translate into the details of the experience? And it's these mystery things that happen, right, that people don't know about, and the help desk is impossible to understand, right? In fact, things like someone in your household, my 15-year-old teenage son, might turn on his PlayStation and it automatically updates a new Fortnite game At the same time, I'm on my Teams call, and if I didn't have fibre, gigabit fibre, that could impact me. Now, if the customer got a bad experience and went, oh, terrible, my Teams call crashed, and then called the help desk and said, what's going on? Well, that help desk person would have no way of knowing any of that behavior. So I think that is a huge gap in everyone's knowledge, is about what's actually going on at that application level. And particularly, the reality today is the vast majority of homes have multiple devices, multiple people. They're all using everything all at the same time. And guess what? They interfere with each other, right? And so really understanding that relationship, I think, is the nirvana, is to, the relationship between me and my kids and my wife, all the different devices and applications we're using, how are they engaging with each other such that any issue is, and I'm going to come back to one thing, which is a bit of a hot topic for me, is we sort of almost need to focus less on the speed I need and my device needs, because perhaps my individual device only needs 300 meg. But when the whole family is doing everything at the same time, that's when you need maybe a gigabit or more. And so rather than being individual person focused, which really comes from the mobile industry, because, mobility services are delivered to one person. And so the speed to that one device matters. But with residential broadband and business broadband, it's really about how that service enables dozens, sometimes hundreds of individual sessions in everyone to get all of that experience. So that is definitely, that's where the gap is, and that's where, you need more visibility.
I think what you're saying, Kurt, is very close to my heart as well. Funnily enough, I think this was about going back 7-8 years when, before we had NBN in the house, where my son would be gaming, and he's a big Counter-Strike player. And funnily, he'd get these massive glitches, and nobody would understand why, till we managed to track it down to my wife's laptop. Whenever she opened it, Dropbox was syncing, and that was affecting his game. So exactly what he said, it's the interplay across these various devices and consumption across the house. And it took us ages to figure out why. And when we figured it out, we were able to solve it, because my son, if his glitch was too long, he would get kicked out of the game because he's spoiling it for everybody else. And he'd be really irate, because for an hour, he'd be storming around the house saying, what happened? Why am I being kicked out of the game? So, and in fact, sorry.
Yeah. And the interest we think, the thing I think where that's going is the focus on an individual device. The issue with that is, if the consumer's thinking, am I getting enough here? They might, like, for example, buy a 300 megabit per second fibre plan, thinking that they only need 300 meg a second to get a good experience on their device. And they don't think about adding it all up. And so if, other people in your house is causing, as you said, maybe the solution is nothing more complicated than upgrading to a gigabit fibre plan, right? And so how do they know, and how does the service provider know that actually the problem is the customer's hasn't purchased a big enough plan, right? Simple thing.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, this is what kind of motivated me to start Canopus, because like you said, we really want to get that visibility at a very fine time scale. It's not enough to just do a speed test and say, hey, my speed test tells me something, because the dynamics of applications like gaming is down at the millisecond level. So you really got to understand what the experience and how it's playing out. And same with, the Netflix speed ramp up, which you mentioned, the micro glitches and disconnects that you mentioned. So I think, as you know, we are very passionate about that, trying to measure experience down at that sub-second scale and in the context of the application and how it disrupts them. So Kurt, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I hope we can work together and both to educate the market on the importance of understanding experience and why that is a driver towards the technology that we choose for our broadband or other connectivity services. And I look forward to speaking with you again in the near future.